been seen. It was the story that grabbed us, held us, and moved us, but there would have been no story if there had not been a storyteller. It was because he did it as he did it that we are so enthralled. He was so much part of the story, he was so much in it, that we soon forgot him, although it was only to him that we were listening. At some point, we as hearers crossed an inevitable line. From that point on, it was impossible for us to separate the teller of the story, and even if he had been telling a story written by somebody else, we would not have objected. If he had called it my story, the teller was the story, and the story was the teller, because the story is incarnational. So is preaching. This perhaps explains why Paul, in expanding the divinely revealed gospel to Romans, calls it my gospel. That is, it is certainly true the great numbers of modern preachers, possibly the majority of them, do not see preaching as incarnational. They believe the message, they even live by it, but as they sound that message, they see it as something separate from themselves. To them, the preacher is the man who stands in the pulpit. The message is what is written on his notes, and he is here to give that. In his mind, he is like a postman. He has a message to deliver. We turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 5. I think, again, it's that emotional detachment. You know, there are preachers in the Reform school of preaching that can be detached and try to be logical and the rest of it. It's that cool, detached mentality, but I think that, again, is principally a Reformed problem. It's not a general evangelical problem. 2 Corinthians 4:5. But when we preach, we should give our all. We do not preach about ourselves, but we preach that Jesus is Lord and that we are servants of Jesus. Yeah, we don't preach ourselves, but for Paul, the gospel was everything, and he was committed to the gospel. It was my gospel. It says the love of Christ in 2 Corinthians 5, verse 14, the love of Christ controls us because we know that one died for all, so all have died. So the love of Christ controls us. In other words, this is not a cold, detached preaching, but it is a warm preaching. Again, it's very similar to what Stuart Olliott was saying before. It's relational. But he's asking for a bit more, that we put our whole being in the preaching. And I think if you don't put your whole heart and mind and soul into your preaching, then you're not really going to connect in your preaching if you're seen as cold and distant. And then finally, he writes, how then does all this affect preaching? Well, a truly biblical preacher realizes that he is completely identified with the gospel message that he preaches. What happens to that message will also happen to him. This sort of word-serving charm offensive is sadly lacking in modern pulpit, and is one of the main reasons why so many men are failing to connect. Even men who are captivating in personal conversation seem unable to carry their appealing ways into the pulpit. As they open up the Word of God to the adults and children in front of them, they come across as stiff, artificial, austere, detached, formal, laboured, standoffish, unrelaxed, and wooden. Again, I think that is a problem of Reform preaching. It's because of the middle class culture and the kind of cultural understanding of the Puritans and the Reformers that we are men of God and we are following the Word of God and we are using the Puritans. And so I think Stuart Olliott there is describing a problem of the Reform community there. And I think the answer to the Reform community and preaching is to really commune with God and to understand the gospel as you claim to understand, and understand that that if you really believe that Christ took the wrath that we deserve, then you should communicate that, and your being should be in it. Yeah? Other issues in preaching that I see today, that I've seen, I want to say in the charismatic word of faith movement, there are some problems in preaching there. I think that too often the word of faith movement and the preachers in that kind of movement preach far too much experience. I think it's good to connect, but it's all about their experience. And many of these preachers become the hero of their own sermons. They will tell long stories about themselves, and it's these stories that they're trying to communicate rather than actually the Word of God. So very often the Word of God is just not expounded. In fact, it's hardly ever expounded. The Word of Life preachers, the charismatic preachers, will bring out a few verses here and there. It will have some biblical content, but I do think that on balance there's no real exposition of the Word of God. I'm saying this from experience. I was in a Word of Life church for about 1.5 years, 2 years, and I was able to see regular preaching of many Word of Life preachers from around the world in the faith movement, and I was able to watch them, listen to them, and hear what they had to say. And predominantly this kind of preaching is based on experience, and there's no expositional preaching of the Word of God. There's no bringing the text and expounding the text in its context. The second thing is, in the word faith movement preaching, very few times is the cross preached, about the wrath of God and judgment. And so the gospel is not fully preached about heaven and hell. It's all about Christ can make you well, Christ can make you better. It's all therapeutic preaching. It's not preaching that's dealing with sin and judgment and the need to get right with God. And also there is very little holiness preaching. Again, it's all about relationships, all about how you can get on in your life, etc. But there's very little about being holy, how to be pure, and how to live a holy life, and how God can help you to live a holy life. So these are two big problems in the Word of Faith faith movement in America and the UK. To counterbalance that, I would encourage you, as Word of Faith preachers, I would encourage you to read John Stott's book On the Cross. Now, I don't agree with John Stott. Sorry about that. I'll just leave that. I'll answer it in a minute. I don't agree with John Stott's annihilationism. Totally disagree with that. I think that's wrong. I believe in the doctrine of hell. Read Shedd's book, The Doctrine of Hell, PDF you can get. But John Stott wrote a great book on the cross, and I would encourage preachers to go and read that book. And when you're preaching, use some of the biblical material that he brings out about the cross. And I would go if you go to Wesley Studies, and go and read some of the old magazines. You can download them, the really old magazines from 1920s, 1924, and look at some of the papers there on how they preached, what they were preaching about on holiness. And I would encourage you to do that. The Wesley Studies is a Manchester fellowship, scholarly fellowship, and there they have scholarly resources on Wesleyanism, and you can find some excellent material. I would encourage you to go and listen to Lloyd Jones, Dr. Martin Lloyd Jones. Recording Trust and listen to his series on preaching and preachers. It's a very good series. And also John Piper's Desiring God Ministries. There are some excellent lectures on preaching there and about preaching. Also, if you want to see good modeled preaching modeled, I would go and listen to the sermons on Together for the Gospel, especially 2014, Al Muller, John MacArthur, David Platt, and people like that, and listen to them and see how they preach. So preaching better, remember it's relational. Remember you're communicating to people, not to you should care for. Remember to preach with your whole being, not to be cold and standoffish. But don't fall into the trap of the word of faith movement where there's no theology. Have some content. Get into the Bible and expound it in its context. And I want to address general evangelicalism. I think there are some dangers in general evangelicalism, in preaching. I think the older preachers need to realize, well, a couple of things. The older preachers need to keep preaching. The older preachers seem to be bowing out. I don't think you should bow out. Keep going as a preacher. You need to realize that the evangelical churches have changed. But many of the evangelical churches don't know very much. They haven't got the biblical reference of evangelicals 20, 30 years ago. So what that means is you can't assume that they know what you're talking about. And you can't assume young people know what you're talking about. So you've got to fill in the gaps for them. You know, it's like you as a preacher know about giving people meat and giving people milk, yeah? Well, you've got to give meat at a milk level. You've got to feed people good, solid food, but at a level that they can relate to. And many people in the churches today are at the milk level. So if you've got young people in your congregation, they're not going to understand where you're coming from. So you need to go down to their level, use illustrations, think where they're at, and then try and bring in biblical truth to that level. You don't compromise the biblical truth, but you need to reduce it